Good morning. Good morning to, and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Um, Welcome to Module 4 of the Natural Systems Agriculture Certificate course. My name is Martin Entz. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba, and it's my pleasure to share this next module with you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we'll get right into the lecture. Okay, here we go. Module 4 has us talking about the plant community and with a focus on diversity as sort of a central part of natural systems agriculture. And as you will recall from previous modules, we are working our way up from the soil to plants and then to animals and up all the way to the ecosphere. So, um, we're going to talk about the plant community in the context of natural systems agriculture. And in the middle here, I have the various themes. We'll talk about functional diversity, crop rotation, intercropping. A lot of the lecture today will be about intercropping. And then some of the ecological services from plant diversity, like pest management. And throughout the lecture, there'll be some examples from around the world. And on this slide, I'm showing the crop ecology textbook by Loomis and Connor because for me, when we talk about the plant community, if there was a sort of a discipline name for this area of work, it's crop ecology. Okay, so let's begin with crop rotation. This is really a very important way to introduce diversity into farming systems. And this table just shows examples of monoculture, two crops per year, all the way to rotations in Canada that have four crops. And so in Canada, in our region here, a rotation of oat, canola, wheat, soybean is really quite popular. In other parts of the world, corn soybean rotation is popular. In the Indo-Gangetic Plain of India, we see a lot of rice wheat systems that are growing two crops in a year, rice in the wet season, wheat in the dry season. And there are places in the world where we have monoculture. Uh, and so some of the comments along those are shown here on the right-hand side. Now, the question of how much diversity is enough has been asked very often. And the answer really depends on whether you're measuring productivity, whether you're measuring pests, or whether you're measuring economics. This meta-analysis looked at spring and winter small grains, then that would be winter wheat or spring wheat. And the answer there was four crops. Four crops in rotation are giving, in terms of yield, the best benefit. The crop that where more the merrier was maize or corn, where the data up in the top here shows that as the number of diversity of crops between maize crops increases, the maize yield goes up. So that is interesting. There's something about maize that makes it very responsive to the factors that are improved by crop diversity. Just to illustrate what how we measure the effect of crop diversity on the sort of the whole picture of outcomes. This study here looked at a maize soybean rotation, maize soybean oat rotation, maize soybean oat underseeded to alfalfa, and then one full year of alfalfa forage. And they described the results in this radar chart, and the further from the center, the higher the value. So if we look here at the need for herbicides, it's much greater in the soybean maize, the 2-year rotation, than it is in these rotations that have 3 crops. So something about that third crop or fourth crop in the rotation is reducing the requirement for herbicides. Same for energy use. If we look at labor, there's exactly the opposite. The 2-crop rotation reduces labor use, and as we increase the diversity, there's more hours required on the field. And so you can see the trade-off here. Uh, Similar profitability, fewer hands required, and you can see why farmers in this case in Iowa in the United States have chosen the simpler 2-year crop rotation. Now, this study here is simply to alert you to the idea that it's not just about diversity per se, it's also about functional diversity. So do the species actually provide different functions? And so the one thing about the rotation that I talked about that's popular right here in Manitoba, let's say a soybean, canola, wheat rotation, those are 3 different functional groups. Soybean is a grain legume, relatively shallow rooted. Canola is an oil seed, the deep taproot. Wheat is cereal with a fibrous taproot or fibrous root, sorry. And so, that's just an example of 3 functional groups. So the more functional diversity is in the rotation, we typically see more benefits in terms of yield productivity. Okay, so I'll give you a moment to stop the video and think about questions that you have or ideas that you would like to share. Now let's turn our attention to intercropping. This review paper, The New Green Revolution, Sustainable Intensification of Agriculture by Intercropping. It showed that globally, we were getting 30% more crop yield when crops were intercropped. And it reduced our energy requirements, and it increased gross income. And here is the data that the authors drew from. All these points here are where intercropping studies were reviewed, and that data was summarized in this figure. And we can see that for almost every intercrop combination, there is over-yielding, which means the land equivalent ratio is greater than 1, and so productivity is increased. Intercropping is the norm in many parts of the world. If we look at Northwest China, very common to intercrop wheat and maize, soybean and maize, flax, soybean and maize, faba bean and maize. Excuse me. And you'll notice that the intercropping is in strips. Okay, and let's go to the next slide. And what researchers have found is that what we call paired row intercropping, where we have 2 rows, for example, of cowpea and then 2 rows of millet, is giving more yield than growing them 1 row of each. And here is some data that was published quite some time ago where maize and sorghum were unaffected in either single or double row configurations, but there was a 31% increase in the soybean yield in the maize-soybean system when the components were arranged in double alternate rows compared to single alternate rows. And they attributed this to the fact that the canopy height of soybean and sorghum or maize that were not only competing with each other for nutrients, but also for light. And by having a paired row, you just allowed a little bit more light into the legume, which is in this case is a low growing legume. Now that may be different when we're intercropping pigeon pea with maize because pigeon pea is much taller. There are all kinds of combinations of intercrops. This image here shows relay intercropping. And just like a relay race, in a track meet, the sprinters they pass the baton to each other. Here we're growing winter wheat, and then before the winter wheat is harvested, we're relay cropping soybean into there. And there are a number of YouTube videos which I have made available here. You can take a look at them, and they're quite exciting, showing this practice. And so the winter wheat is harvested at a time when the soybean is still vegetative, and the winter wheat is probably not yielding as much as if it was a monocrop, and the soybean is not yielding as much as a spring-seeded soybean crop in this context, but the two in combination provide a higher overall yield in the field. And when we think about mycorrhiza, which we talked about previously, mycorrhiza require live plants to sustain themselves in soil. And this shows that we have a very nice handoff of energy coming into the mycorrhizal network, first the winter wheat and then the soybean. And the way this is harvested is there are paddles which press the soybean down, which allow the machine to cut the wheat. And then when the machine passes, the soybean comes back up. And the tires of the harvester travel between the rows of the soybeans. Now, in Ontario, where the growing season is shorter than, this is in Canada now, where the growing season is shorter than in some of those American examples, or in France, farmers are planting the soybean earlier in the season, just to make sure that that soybean is going to be able to mature before the frosts arrive. So the system is adapted to the length of the growing season. So intercropping for yield is something that is seen as quite important, and I'd like to hear your thoughts or your questions around that. Let's switch our gears to the ecological services from intercropping. The first one is that I want to talk about is hydraulic lifting. And this involves growing a deep-rooted crop with a more shallow-rooted crop. And in this case, we're looking at pigeon pea, and research, especially in these controlled conditions, demonstrate that maize plants are receiving some water from this pigeon pea, which is actually extracting water from deeper down in an area where in this experiment, the maize roots cannot go that deep due to a barrier. And so they're using deuterium, which is a labeled oxygen, and that allows the researchers to know where that water is coming from. So hydraulic lift means water is being brought from deeper in the profile up to the surface and then shared with other plants or shared with soil microbes, which also need water. This is just another example of the 18 oxygen isotopic labeling and then water fluctuations. So they're looking at methods of studying this concept of hydraulic lift. And so the hydraulic lift is a real phenomenon, and it is one of the reasons why, in some cases, intercrops do so much better, especially if a deep-rooted plant is grown in combination with a shallow-rooted plant. These research found that when drought circumstances exist, there is a biofertilization benefit in a pigeon pea finger millet system. The pigeon pea, which is deeper rooted here on the right, can benefit the finger millet, and the benefit occurs through this common mycorrhizal network. And the water from the pigeon pea is allowing the finger millet to withstand drought. So very exciting, actually. So bioirrigation is what they're calling it here. Now, the other transfer in intercrops that's important, the other ecological service is that there will be movement of nitrogen from legumes to grasses. And this has been demonstrated in many different studies. This bottom one here is a Canadian study looking at an alfalfa brome grass. And in this case, a lot of the nitrogen from in this case, the alfalfa legume was uh, added to the soil, and the grass was able to take it through mineralization of the nitrogen from those soil pools. So the other major mechanism by which you can get nitrogen transferred is through the common mycorrhizal network. So both of these networks operate in mixtures, and they're both important. The legume is also capable of extracting nitrogen from the grass if the grass plant happens to have a lot of nitrogen. And alfalfa is particularly good at that. Research has demonstrated that. This paper is interesting because it looks at how intercropping wheat and canola have significantly decreased the available cadmium content in the root zone of both of these crops, promoting the transformation of soil cadmium from a highly toxic to less toxic form. So cadmium is a heavy metal which accumulates in agriculture when we add phosphorus fertilizer, because the process of making phosphoric acid releases cadmium, and then it's a problem in some cases in Canadian export crops. So those are biophysical benefits of intercropping. I want to talk about food security benefits, and this is based on research in Zimbabwe conducted by Mike Solomons as part of a graduate thesis. And so what we had, I'll explain this. There were 3 locations in western and southern Zimbabwe where maize was either intercropped with cowpea or grown in monoculture. And then the other treatment was that there was mulching, which means putting crop residue on the surface to conserve water. And these 2 systems were tested at these locations over a number of years. The land equivalent ratio in the unmulched intercrop, you can see a much higher total yield when the crops were grown together, the cowpea and the maize. And when they were mulching was also used, at one of the locations, the yield was really not improved. At the other 2, it was. So the intercrop was kind of doing what we expected it should do. Now, what this next table shows is the economic value of crops produced on a hypothetical 0.5 hectare conservation agriculture plot. And conservation agriculture means adding mulch and intercropping. So this shows the income from the maize, the income from the cowpea, and then the net benefit. So the net benefit is greater where we're mulching and adding the legume intercrop. The lowest income was where we grew maize with no mulch, so maize without any of the conservation agriculture principles. And when mulch alone was added, there was a benefit which was quite important. But what I want to share today is what Mike did is took the actual yields from this on-farm research and calculated the profit loss calculations, assuming the minimum food needs for a family of 6. So the black numbers indicate a surplus of production, which can be sold, and the red numbers indicate a deficit of production, indicating that these commodities must be bought. So if we look at a field of 0.25 hectares, which is not unrealistic in Zimbabwe, when we grow monoculture maize with no mulch, there's a food insecurity problem, and the family needs to have this much money in US dollars to buy food security. When the cowpea is added, we can see that on balance, there's an increase in food security as indicated by a positive value. Where we grow mulch, maize monoculture with mulch, at two of the locations, there's food security. At the third, there's not. But when we add the combination of intercropping cowpea and mulch, you can see we've got food security in all three cases. And this just shows the value of conservation agriculture for food security. When the simulation was conducted with a larger plot, 0.5 hectare, all of the systems provided food security, but the one with the combination of intercropping and mulching provided the largest benefit. Now, if we were to have to select either intercropping or mulching monocrop maize, which would we select? Well, if we look here at maize with mulching, we've got 134, 700, $600. If we look at intercropping, we've got 600, 700, almost 800, and 1,000. So the conclusion here would be that on this size of a plot, intercropping which is also easier to do, would probably be our first choice. Mulching alone requires more labor, and you have to have the mulch. The combination resulted in the best outcome, however. So I'll let you reflect on that. Those are the sort of ecological services from intercropping that involve hydraulic lifting, nitrogen, cadmium, and also food security. Okay, so let's move into some sort of plant physiology where I want to talk a little bit about sort of how intercropping actually affects the whole system. And one of the interesting things is that while plants do not have brains, they can't react like animals do, they do respond to their environment. And so plant interactions involve perception through cues and signals and plastic behavioral responses. And that's illustrated here by these trees. This tree is growing away from these two trees. Why is that? It has to do with the way they perceive their environment. So one of the first things that plants respond to is light. They perceive light, and if they're growing in full sunlight, they will grow in a particular way. And if they're shaded by the intercrop plant, then they're going to grow in a slightly different way. The important thing I want to point out here is that when we have, on the right here, you can see my cursor, when we have full sunlight, we have far red and red light in sort of equal proportions. And when we have shading occur, there's still a lot of far red light being perceived, but the red light concentration is lower. And that actually causes the plant to stretch out, to become, we call it more etiolated. Okay, so the low ratio of red to far red light is indicative of vegetative shading. And we can see an example of it here. This is a portulaca plant growing. And when the over here, when we reduce the red to far red light ratio, there's less growth here and more growth out here. So the growth direction changes. So the plant, the reason it would be a low red, far red over here is because there would be a taller plant growing. So the portulaca grows away in the direction away from the shading plant. So this is an example of how plants respond. Now, some plants have evolved to tolerate shade. If we look at legumes, for example, red clover, white clover are much more shade tolerant than alfalfa, for example. So when plants grow in full sunlight, they tend to invest relatively few resources in stretching out. But if we have a plant growing in shade, they tend to increase their leaf area. They tend to be taller. The leaf positioning may change, and they may change their chlorophyll constituents somehow. And but some, if they're really adapted to shade, they won't stretch out like we often see in agriculture. You know, weeds at the below the maize, they're very spindly, but really shade tolerant plants, they actually are happy to grow in shade and they stay low to the ground, like we can see here. Now, the light information that the plants get is also important. So light information is more than just quantity and the spectrum. By the spectrum, I mean the red to far red ratio. And so here, if we look at this plant growing under this tree, and we think about midday when the sun is overhead, that's vertical shading. This might indicate to this plant that it has a very tall neighbor, so don't bother trying to catch up. And that might be kind of like this situation over here, where these plants remain low because they're perceiving that high far red red ratio. On the other hand, if you have plant, and an example of that, if you have trees growing along with your crops. On the other hand, if you have intercrops that are about the same height, and we think about later in the day when the sun is closer to the horizon, the far red ratios will indicate that to the plants that their neighbors are about the same height, and so they should continue to grow. And an example of that is these types of intercrops, especially at this stage of development. When the maize is not tall, we can see the faba bean growing between the maize would receive similar light quality even later in the day than the maize. Now, later on, when the maize gets taller, the faba bean will start getting shaded later in the day. And so that will tell the faba bean plant that that it is being shaded, it's got a tall competitor, and that may actually hasten its maturity. So these are the ways that plants actually sense other plants in the intercrop, and that's important to know. Now, competition also occurs below ground, so when resources are abundant, the plants allocate less biomass to their roots. So low nitrogen, you can see more root growth, high nitrogen, not so much. And then the roots can also determine where there's nutrient hotspots, and they will proliferate their roots in that zone. And this is quite interesting for conservation agriculture, where you have planting pits with maybe some manure and maybe some fertilizer. One would expect a proliferation of roots right there in that nutrient pool. And plants sometimes respond differently to varieties that are different than themselves. So here we have the same excuse me, genotype or the same library variety, and the plants are overlapping their roots. And here, if you're looking simply at different varieties, the plants actually avoid each other. So there's all kinds of ways that plants are kind of sensing their situation. Now, this is a complicated sort of diagram. And if you want to learn more about the whole area of resource pool, Matthew Ryan at Cornell University has worked a lot in this area. But what I'm talking about here is let's go through these pictures. This is what we call a single resource pool. And so the resource pool is this dark area here in the soil. And in this case, both crop types, in this case, we're talking about weeds, but these could easily be intercrops. They're actually tapping into the same resource pool. Again, same resource pool. Now here we have multiple resource pools. We have, what does that mean? Well, we may have in a planting station situation, that might be manure and that might be fertilizer, or that might be manure and that might be the soil organic matter. And so when you have different resource pools, you actually increase the total productivity of the intercrop because the competition between plants is reduced. And then here, this is the ideal situation. You have multiple resource pools, which I talked about in just a minute ago, but now you have very different plant species. This species taps into this resource pool. This species taps into this resource pool. Now you're looking at very significant increases in productivity. And this is probably the situation that occurs when your land equivalent ratio is 1.5 up at those very high levels. Okay, so now how do we achieve those different resource pools? Well, I mentioned we could look at fertilizer and manure and the soil organic matter. All three of those are resource pools. We could also manipulate them by where we place those nutrients. And over the long term, we can manipulate the cropping system to provide different resource pools. So simply by growing a diversity of crops, we actually encourage different resource pools. So this is not always easy to see as a farmer or as an agronomist, but over time, as these ecologically based cropping systems become mature, we start seeing a higher productivity, and this is one of the reasons. Now, the other reason why the other thing that's happening here is even though these plants might be tapping into different resource pools, they're going to be sharing resources through the common mycorrhizal network. And this example is quite striking. I should explain it. Here we have flax growing by itself. Here we have sorghum growing by itself. They both are connected through their mycorrhizal network. But when we grow them together, the flax plant is much larger. In this experiment, it increased by 46%, and the sorghum only reduced its growth by 7%. And sorghum is a very carbon-rich plant. It has lots of carbon to spare, and that's one of the reasons why this intercrop just does so much better. Now the sorghum is probably getting some elements from the flax, maybe some micronutrients, because flax is very, very mycorrhizal. But it's an example of how adding the right combination of crops to, for example, the multiple resource pools can make these systems very, very productive. A couple of examples before I get you to reflect. Plants also perceive stress. whether it's mechanical damage or insect attack or diseases or drought, they respond, they perceive those stresses. So there is research which tells us that as the plant is stressed by either an insect attack or something eating its roots, it is going to produce these volatiles. That's what this is. These are volatiles, plant volatiles. And other plants that are not yet attacked will perceive the threat through those volatiles, and they'll turn on their self-defense mechanisms. And the volatiles will actually change the DNA in these plants, and that change can last for up to 5 days. So plants are talking to each other, and these plants are perceiving this stress without actually being stressed. So the wonderful world of plants and all of its diversity and the things that can that allow the plant to adapt to different environments really is the underlying principle behind the intercropping over-yielding. So I'll give you a chance to think about that and to add some questions into the soil. Grow your ideas. All right, let's come back to a practical application of all of this. I want to talk about plant diversity for pest management. And well, when it comes to insects, just a couple of things that are important. Many insects really don't cause any problems, so you don't have to use an insecticide just because they're there. So we need to know which insects are causing which problem. Pest problems are less likely to occur in a complex environment. Intercropping and cover cropping can reduce insect problems. Focus on cultivating beneficial insects in the fields or on farms. But large-scale problems are difficult to manage. And so locusts, grasshoppers are large-scale problems that we face. I'm going to go right into, I'll come back to those points. So I want to talk about prevention, avoiding the problems. And there are some things to do. The resistant varieties are useful, but I want to talk about intercropping and landscape diversity today. The simple example of how intercropping can reduce pests is demonstrated here, where peas are grown either with canola or flax or oats. And here you can see a pea canola intercrop. And on the left axis here is the aphid count of each treatment at 2 different times of the year. And we can see that peas grown alone have more aphid pests. When we have other crops growing with them, we reduce the pest load on those plants. And the reason for that is that the aphid cannot find the peas as easily, and also these other crops might host more beneficial predators, which are going to eat the aphids. Another strategy that involves intercropping and also some field arrangement is a push-pull planting system. This is a paper where they looked at putting desmodium, which is a legume, between the rows of maize. And the desmodium repels the moths of the corn borer. And then the Napier grass grown around the field attracts the insects by producing attractive volatile chemicals. And so the pest moves from the maize field where it can do damage to the Napier grass where it is actually killed. This is a paper from Kenya, and it looks at the mean maize grain yield in a monocrop versus a push-pull system. The push-pull system always yielding higher. Here we have the push-pull system with the desmodium. And here we have the feeding marks of the stem borer on the Napier grass. And the Napier grass has sticky material, which reduces the happiness and even kills the larvae. So other types of push-pull systems exist. Here we have a sorghum growing with intercropped with a non-host molasses grass, and it reduced the pest, and you can see the attractant crop growing on the outside of the field. And of course, this can be used for fodder, it could be used for mulch, it can be used for other things. This paper here from 2008 looks at on-farm evaluation of push-pull technology for control of stem borers, and actually also the striga weed, because striga desmodium in particular reduces striga quite effectively. And in this case, on all the farms, the push-pull reduced the stem borers and increased the maize yield, sometimes doubling the maize yield. So that's something I maybe, especially those of you who are working in Southern Africa, East Africa, you may have some particular questions or observations about the push-pull system, like I described from Kenya. Now I want to turn to Manitoba, where grasshoppers are a constant in our agroecosystem. Of the 85 species, really only 3 are potential pests, so you need to know which ones there are. But when we have long droughts and we have the grasshopper population builds up, and they are absolutely devastating. They will eat everything. This is a quote from a farmer in Saskatchewan, and here you can see the flax plant. All of the seeds have been eaten. Here you can see the weed seeds have been eaten. Grasshoppers can be extremely devastating. Now, grasshoppers work in cycles. They are a reminder that nature works in cycles. In hot, dry years, they can get ahead of their enemies, and then they can proliferate. In cool, wet years, natural predators and parasites will get the better of them. The fact that we have so much cereal domination of our landscape really drives the grasshopper population. Now, there are some ways of dealing with this, and this first example is actually a story out of grazing management, and in this case, a grazing system called the twice-over grazing system, which is more like how animals would have grazed naturally in the grassland area of our country. You can see it resulted in a very low level of grasshopper days, whereas the season-long grazing, where the animals were just sent out to the pasture and they can graze for 3-4 months, whatever they want, there the grasshopper population built up. And the reason why this twice-over grazing system, which I should explain, is a very light grazing early in June, and then a more intense grazing later in August. What it does is it disrupts the thermoregulation of the grasshoppers. So you can read this on your own, but the temperature at the soil level does dictate a lot of the grasshopper's growth cycle, development cycle. And on this farm here that I showed you earlier, this area up here is all native rangeland, and these farmers have used twice-over grazing for many decades now, and that has really helped reduce their grasshopper population. So in summary, how do we prevent grasshopper outbreaks? And by the way, a repeated insecticide application does not work in an intense grasshopper outbreak year. You have to kind of plan ahead and use a more nature-based approach. What I want to go to point number 4 here, alternating availability of bare ground and canopy cover. It affects the thermoderegulation, and that is one of the reasons why the twice over grazing system works, but it is one of the most important tools. Now, landscape diversity is also important, and habitat manipulation to reduce these nymphal development, like tillage, fire, and cover crops might work. But landscape diversity, what I'm showing here in these white enclosures, this is actually a diverse organic farm, and we're comparing it here to conventional agriculture where we're looking really at 2 or 3 crops with very little sort of natural areas. This is going to be more subject to grasshopper outbreak than this farm here. Now, the other crop that we grow in over large areas is canola, Brassica napus, and it has its own insect pest problem, and that is the flea beetle. And the flea beetle, it's a Coleoptera species. There it is here on the canola seedling. It is very damaging, and in hot, dry springs, it will kill these canola very easily, and farmers not only treat the seed with an insecticide, they have to come and spray the field maybe more than once to reduce the effect, and that is not always effective. So there's been interest in intercropping for flea beetle control, and the research is limited. There's not that much data on it, but this one paper from North Dakota showed that it was not effective to intercrop peas with canola. That should say peas. So, it's not a panacea. Not all biological nature-based solutions work. So I'll let you think about that, the role of diversity in insect control. All right, so we're talking about plant diversity. Let's talk not about insects, but shift our gears to diseases. How can different strategies reduce disease outbreak? Well, these images here, which I'll explain in just a minute, show the value of crop rotation in reducing the problem of clubroot, which is a serious disease of canola. So here we have a plot of back-to-back canola. That means canola is grown every year. We have a variety of canola that is resistant to this root pathogen, and we have a variety that is susceptible and one that is moderately susceptible. And we can see in this case, growing the resistant variety is the only possible solution. And take a look at the size of that crop. If we have a 2-year rotation, so we have a break crop between canola, you can see we're getting more growth of our resistant variety. We actually are getting better growth of our moderately susceptible and still nothing in our susceptible. And then if we have canola only every 3 years, you can see the picture starts to change. We actually do have some growth of the susceptibles, but look at the resistant variety. It's growing so much better. That's going to be a more profitable rotation. And if we go to 4 years between canola, we get an even larger crop. So if you compare, let's say, this crop where we grow canola every 2 years to this crop where we grow canola every 4 years, you can see a massive improvement in growth. So even the resistant variety was benefiting from the rotation, and that may be related to suppression of clubroot. And then if we look at a 5-year rotation, it's even better. There we're getting more growth of the susceptible and the moderately susceptible. So I'm showing you this sequence of images to illustrate the importance of crop rotation in dealing with crop diseases. It's very, very critically important. Now, there's also some strategies where we can be very strategic in designing our crop rotation to reduce diseases. Verticillium wilt in potatoes is a serious problem, and what farmers have discovered and researchers have discovered is that these high glucosinolate mustard plants are a very good way to fumigate the soil to kill the fungus that causes verticillium wilt. And there's very specific ways of doing it. You have to mulch the mustard and then incorporate it within 5 minutes, preferably immediately, like they're doing here. And that allows, that is a rotation that very, very effectively reduces this fungus. And I should add that the alternative is to use methyl bromide to fumigate the soil, but methyl bromide also kills so many other soil organisms, and it also releases greenhouse gases. This is a much better way to go. Other plants that suppress diseases, this diagram here looks at brassicas and even oats at suppressing common root rot of peas caused by Aphanomyces. Aphanomyces is a root fungus which limits pea production in wetter areas of Canada, including Manitoba. And so here we're growing an oat cover crop at our Glenley Research Station. And one of the reasons we're growing it is to reduce the root rot of next year's pea crop. So even oats are known to produce 44 fungistatic compounds that cause different spores of pathogens like fungi to die. And so there are all kinds of opportunities to reduce that problem. And here we have an organic farm in Manitoba, and you can see the oat cover crop. This is springtime, spring seeding. The oat cover crop has died over winter due to frost, and now they're direct seeding into there with the hopes of having some fungicidal benefit of those oats. Another, and we're still talking about Aphanomyces, which is the very damaging root organism that affects peas. We also know, in addition to having drier soils and less soil compaction, these reduce this problem. Mycorrhiza fungi will also provide some protection of soil roots. And so systems that build up their mycorrhizal spores and networks are going to be better at growing peas in wet years. So that's a little bit on diseases, using crop rotation and other forms of plant diversity. I want to end off the lecture by talking about another natural systems approach to pathogen management. Compost tea is something that is talked about quite a bit. What is compost tea? Well, it could simply be compost, added into water, and then the water is sprayed on the plot. There's all kinds of definitions of it and all kinds of ways that it can be used. The research shows that compost tea has a fairly limited value on improving soil health in most situations, especially in Canada, where our soil health is quite good. But where compost tea does have a role to play is in disease management. So our colleague, Mohammed Islam in Bangladesh, worked with compost tea on late blight of potato and tomato and compared it to fungicide. And if we look here at potato, the control, which is T1 here, 65% of the leaf area was diseased with late blight, but the fungicide and the compost tea were equally effective at reducing that infection. And a similar result, not quite as powerful on tomato. Here's the yields from those studies. You can see how in potato the yield was increased massively by using compost tea, and the yield was also increased with tomato by adding compost tea, and the compost tea was almost as good or better than the fungicide. So compost tea as a foliar spray in the case of tomato, and soil drenching, it can be used in different ways. In the case of tomato, may be the best alternative approach to control late blight of these crops with higher economic return. They did caution that compost tea should also be tested against other pathogens, but in terms of late blight fungus, it was quite effective. So you can think a little bit about the compost tea idea and ask yourself some questions or share some ideas. Okay, that brings us to the end of Module 4, where we talked about plant diversity. I look forward to receiving your questions on this. And now I will sign off, and I will wish you a good evening, good morning, or good afternoon. Take care.